If you want to know how to get rid of squash bugs, this is usually where the problem begins. You turn over a leaf that looked almost normal from above, and underneath it, you find an entire little neighborhood that apparently moved in without asking permission. When I find a leaf like this, I don't start by spraying the whole garden. I deal with what is already in front of me. The eggs come off, the young bugs come off, and every adult I can reach comes off with them. A few minutes later, this is the same leaf. Much better. But don't confuse a clean leaf with a solved problem. Squash bugs are very good at making you think you have finished just because you removed the ones you could see. Some are underneath another leaf. Some are close to the soil. Some are hiding where you would never think to spray. And later in this video, I want to show you one method that seems completely backwards at first, because instead of trying to drive squash bugs away, you actually give them somewhere they would rather go. Stay with me until the end for that one, because once you understand why it works, you may stop chasing these bugs around the garden altogether. For now, though, we need to deal with the family that is already living here. The first thing I care about is not the largest bug. It is the smallest thing on the leaf. Squash bug eggs are usually bronze or copper colored and laid together in little groups, often underneath the leaves or around the veins. Once you have seen them a few times, they become fairly easy to recognize. And finding them is good news, because this is the easiest stage of the problem you are ever going to get. An adult squash bug can run from you. An egg has very poor escape skills, so if I find an egg cluster, I remove it while I am standing there. A little piece of sticky tape can lift the eggs away without much trouble. You can also carefully scrape them from the leaf if you can do it without damaging the plant, and occasionally there will be a small piece of badly damaged leaf that is easier simply to remove. What I would not do is look at 30 eggs, tell myself I will remember them tomorrow, and walk away. Tomorrow, they may no longer be eggs. This is one of those places where gardening rewards the person who is slightly lazy in the correct way. Removing a small cluster today is much less work than dealing with dozens of insects later, but perhaps you didn't find the eggs early enough. Maybe you turn the leaf over and find a group of small gray bugs moving around underneath it. Those are the young squash bugs, or nymphs, and this is still a very useful time to find them because they are easier to control than the mature adults. When there are only a few, I prefer the simple approach. Knock them into a container of soapy water and remove them from the plant. No ceremony is required. If there are too many for that to be practical, insecticidal soap or horticultural oil can help with young nymphs, but there is one detail that matters much more than people expect. You have to reach the bug. A contacted treatment sitting beautifully on top of a leaf doesn't do much for a squash bug living underneath it. I see this mistake all the time with garden pests. Someone sprays from above until every plant is shining, steps back feeling very accomplished, and underneath the leaf, the insects are probably wondering why it suddenly started raining. Turn the leaf over. Find where they are gathering. Treat the actual insects according to the directions on the product you are using. That sounds obvious when somebody says it, but gardening is full of obvious things we forget when we are annoyed, and squash bugs are very good at making people annoyed. Once they become adults, they are sturdier, faster, and much better at disappearing. You reach for one, it walks around the stem. You follow it around the stem, and now somehow you are negotiating with an insect. I don't enjoy negotiations with squash bugs. If I can reach an adult, I remove it and drop it into soapy water. On a small garden, doing this consistently can make a real difference. Every adult you remove is one less bug feeding on the plants and potentially producing another generation. But I don't want to spend the entire morning searching through every vine. Fortunately, squash bugs have a habit that makes them easier to collect. They like shelter. During the cooler part of the night, adults will often hide underneath protected objects near the plants. So in the evening, I can place a flat board or even a sturdy piece of cardboard on the soil close to the squash. Then I leave it alone. The next morning, preferably while it is still cool, I lift it. Sometimes there is nothing there. Gardening does not sign contracts with us. But when squash bugs are active in the area, you may find several of them gathered underneath. Now notice what happened. Yesterday, they could hide underneath dozens of leaves, vines, and pieces of debris. Instead of searching all those places, I gave them one more hiding place, except this one was mine. I know exactly where it is. So in the morning, I lift the board and collect whatever has gathered there. If there are several adults, you can knock them into soapy water. Some gardeners with larger infestations also use a small vacuum to collect bugs quickly, as long as they are careful around the plant. I like the board, because it doesn't ask the squash bug to behave differently. It already wants to hide. We simply remember where we gave it a roof. This is also why I pay attention to what is lying around the base of an infested squash plant. Old leaves, pieces of wood, dead vines, and heavy garden debris all create little protected places. Even mulch, which is normally very useful in a garden, can become shelter when there is a large squash bug population hiding underneath everything. That doesn't mean mulch suddenly became bad. Gardening would be much easier if things were always either good or bad, but nature usually refuses to be that convenient. Mulch can protect moisture, reduce weeds, and help the soil. But if I have a serious squash bug problem and the adults disappear into a very thick layer every time I approach, I may temporarily reduce some of those hiding places around the affected plants. Sometimes, the thing protecting your soil is also protecting the bug. You don't have to turn the garden into bare dirt. You simply stop giving an infestation more shelter than it needs. Then I come back. This part is important, because squash bugs are rarely a problem you solve in one visit. You can remove every adult you find today and still have an egg cluster underneath another leaf. You can remove those eggs and still have young nymphs somewhere else. A few days later, something you missed may appear. So instead of one enormous attack on the garden, I would rather interrupt their life cycle several times. Today, I remove what I see. A few days later, I check again. Then again. Each time there should be less to find. Eventually, turning over a few leaves every time you walk through the garden becomes enough to keep the population from becoming overwhelming. And I mean a few leaves. You don't need to inspect every leaf as if the garden is going through airport security. Start with the older leaves. Look underneath. Check around the stems and the center of the plant. Once you know what the eggs look like, your eye finds them much faster. The same thinking can begin before the bugs arrive. Young squash plants can be protected with lightweight row cover while they are getting established. The idea is almost embarrassingly simple. The plant is underneath the barrier. The squash bug is outside the barrier. Sometimes, the best pest control is a door. The important complication comes later, when the plants begin flowering, because squash flowers need pollinators. At that point, the cover usually needs to come off, unless you are managing pollination yourself. So I think of row cover as early protection, not something that stays over the plants forever. Give the young plant some time to grow without being discovered. Then when flowering begins, remove the protection and begin watching underneath the leaves. At the end of the season, I do something equally unexciting but useful. I clean up the finished vines. Squash bugs like sheltered places, and old plant material gives them exactly that. Leaving dead squash vines, piles of leaves and garden debris sitting around until the next growing season can make life easier for a pest you would rather make uncomfortable. I don't clean because I want the garden to look like a photograph. I clean because I don't want to provide free winter accommodation. The squash bugs have already eaten enough, but even after doing all of this, removing eggs, controlling the young insects, trapping adults under boards, reducing hiding places, protecting young plants, we still have the problem I mentioned at the beginning. Squash bugs arrive because they want squash. So what if you use that preference instead of constantly fighting against it? This is where Blue Hubbard squash becomes interesting. Blue Hubbard can be grown as what is called a trap crop. It is particularly attractive to squash bugs and some other squash pests. Instead of expecting every plant in the garden to be equally interesting to them, you deliberately grow a plant they may prefer near the crop you are trying to protect. Ideally, you get that trap plant established early enough that it is already attractive when the insects begin arriving. Now imagine the garden from the bug's point of view. There are several plants available, but one of them is especially appealing. Wonderful. Let them make a choice. The purpose isn't to magically repel squash bugs from everything else. The purpose is to concentrate more of the pest pressure in a place you already know to watch. Now, instead of wandering through every squash vine looking for adults and eggs, you pay especially close attention to that Blue Hubbard. And there is one very important part people can misunderstand about trap crops. You still have to control the bugs that gather there. Otherwise, you didn't create a trap. You created a squash bug restaurant. The Blue Hubbard attracts them. You inspect it frequently. You remove the eggs. You collect adults. You deal with the young bugs before they spread. The plant helps you decide where much of your attention should go. That is why I said this method feels backwards. Most pest advice begins with the idea that we must make the insect leave. This method says something different. If you insist on coming into my garden, I would prefer you stand over there. And I like that way of thinking, because it is the same principle behind several of the methods we have already used. The board works because squash bugs want shelter. Looking underneath the leaves works because they already like that protected surface. The trap crop works because they already prefer certain plants. We aren't trying to teach the insect new behavior. We are learning its old behavior. That distinction makes many garden problems easier. If I had an infested squash plant in front of me today, I wouldn't search for one magic bottle that promises to solve everything. I would turn over the leaves and take away the eggs before they hatch. I would remove the young bugs while they are still easier to control. I would collect every adult I could reach and give the ones I couldn't reach a board to hide under tonight. Then I would look around the base of the plant and ask whether I had accidentally created 10 more hiding places for them. And then, a few days later, I would come back and do it again. Not forever, just long enough to break the cycle. Next season, if squash bugs are a regular problem in that garden, I would begin earlier. Protect the young plants when it makes sense. Keep the area manageable. Inspect before the leaves begin suffering. And perhaps let a Blue Hubbard stand at the edge of the garden doing some of the attracting for you. Then something changes. Squash bugs stop being a surprise. You know what the eggs look like. You know where the young ones gather. You know where the adults like to disappear. And you have somewhere specific to look before the population becomes large. That is usually the difference between an irritating garden pest and a ruined squash plant. Not whether you own the strongest spray, whether you found the problem while it was still small enough to be easy. A garden normally gives you the easy version first. A few eggs, a few young bugs, one adult hiding underneath a leaf. If we ignore that version, eventually the garden gives us the difficult one. I prefer the easy one. So turn over the leaf, remove what you find, come back before the next generation gets comfortable, and if the squash bugs insist on choosing a place to hide or feed, make sure some of those choices work in your favor. That usually costs a lot less than fighting them after they have taken over. Uncle Han knows a cheaper way.